So you must truly either be one of our friends or love monsters, because you're here at 9:30. And there's 5 of us. I'm going to let everybody sort of introduce themselves as we go. And it's very, very informal, and I'm very excited to see how it's all gonna roll out. We decided that we would go from my stage left down to the right, I guess is the best way to go. About 10, 12 minutes each. Shelby's gonna be our timekeeper, because she's the one who has the phone up. And Chris also has a phone if we want to keep time. And then hopefully, if we all keep our time, we'll have room for questions and discussion afterwards. So, with no further ado, I'll give it over to Shelby Janicki.
I had to start my timer. Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. My name is Shelby Janicki. I just graduated in May with my Bachelor's of Science in Family and Human Services, so I'm not as focused on curriculum in my typical studies, but I do love monsters. So yeah, the end. And actually my education experience has been a little bit unique in the sense that it has incorporated a lot of Gothic literature and monster scholarship. I first started studying monsters whenever I was a senior in high school. I took AP Literature, and in that class, we got to do a genre study. Horror was not a genre available from my teacher at the time, but my friend and I said, hey, we think that this would be kind of interesting to study. So we did. And then I went on to college. In my very first semester of college, I was placed in Tuesdays and Thursdays in consecutive classes, going from honors demonology and witchcraft and literature into Morna's class, which was my Towson seminar on vampires. So it kind of became am I going to Towson University or am I going to Hogwarts? It was a very unique experience. Going from there, I decided within the Honors College to do 2 independent studies, and went on to work further with Morna on 2 of those, each incorporating, yet again, monsters. But I learned very early on in my sort of monster educational experience that what we had was much more than just scary stories. These monsters were representative of people's inner demons, of their dual identities and different taboos. We had more than just jump scares and page turners. We had characters with complex histories and diseases, mental illnesses. There was a lot to be said and a lot to be learned about these beasts. So coming to this conference, I had to, 1, learn how to pronounce Carrere, which I still am not 100% confident in, but I think that you all at least generally know what I'm trying to say. And I had to figure out how this notion of curriculum could become something that I could speak on, because again, I come from a little bit of a different background than just education. And so I figured, whenever authors write stories, the purpose of writing is in any form to share knowledge, and to share knowledge is to teach. So therefore, I view these authors all as teachers. And whenever I decided to do my first independent study with Morna, which is the one that I am going to be focusing most on today, I had been writing short stories and fun novels of my own, and I saw the way that my own experiences in my own life informed my writings, and I wanted to see how these authors of these famous stories, Dracula, Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, how these authors used their societal experiences and their life experiences to inform their own work, what they were trying to tell us all, what they were trying to communicate during their lives and in their stories, which I thought was, and we have been talking about making up words, but I thought it was very Carrerical of them. It's kind of, if you use the word enough, maybe people will think you know what you're talking about.
I'm going to give you a PhD.
The end. Thank you all for coming to my dissertation. But yeah, just sort of this idea of surely if this is what was happening with me, it was happening with these authors as well. So they have in their works this self-examination and this incorporation of their lives and their experiences. And it can tell us a lot about their stories. It can tell us a lot about taboo topics that, at the time, these stories all came out in the 1800s. It was too taboo to discuss these things at face value. You had to express them under this veil of fiction with these monsters because people were going to be more susceptible to reading a fictional story about something and sort of processing these ideologies at a subconscious level. So a little bit more about the 1800s. I am not a history teacher. I'm not here to bore you. But it is important to note that Gothic literature, a lot of the big names came out during that time. We had this shift from Christianity to science, where everything wasn't just explained by God or prayer anymore. There were scientific advancements, which led to a lot of free thinking, leading into academia and technology. There were a lot of changes occurring, and the authors addressed these shifts. Like I said, through the veils of fiction, they can express their opinion, and they can make sense of this new world for people. I want to start with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and what that was able to convey during the time and still today. The way that I would like to sort of discuss these things is from the view of society, the author's personal lives, and then how that influenced their stories. So for Mary Shelley, she wrote in the earlier part of the century, and it was a time whenever illness was really feared. You didn't have a lot of the vaccinations and anything yet. And so there was sort of just this general question of, how can we increase our immortality? Because people were fearing death, and they didn't have a lot of control over it. But we sort of had this emergence of microscopes, and an understanding of microorganisms and diseases started to emerge, which gave humans sort of a godlike control. And we had to understand how we were going to utilize that and what the cautions of that should be. For her personal life, Mary Shelley had sort of an unfortunate story. Her mother died right away during childbirth, and from there she was raised by her father, who was sort of an anchor of radical thinking and free thought, and it led her to get exposed to all these sort of notable people, including Percy Shelley, who she then went on to marry, but at the time he was married to somebody else, and they had an affair, and then he eventually, out of guilt, returned to his wife, who he got pregnant, and then she killed herself. And so Mary Shelley had this sort of sense of guilt, I suppose, with the return of Percy Shelley, that, his wife was driven to kill herself from finding out about the affair that we had. And then from there, once they were married, she was plagued by her own experiences with miscarriages. And so it's not really a surprise that she wrote about the creation of life, because that was something that she was so unable to do in her own experience. Victor Frankenstein, because for those of you who may not know, Frankenstein is not the green guy with the bolts in his head. Dr. Frankenstein is the man who creates the monster, the creature. And he creates him because he's sort of unsatisfied with these religious answers, much like many people in society at that time. And he sort of had this thirst for fact and inquiry, which drove him to become a monster, which drove him to become a doctor, and to, have this great scientific discovery. But at the same time, he fears his monster, where the story becomes kind of a cautionary tale of, you can't play God like so many people are starting to. You have to do it within limits. You have to have have rules and standards and limits to it, because otherwise your hunger for knowledge becomes almost like a poison, and it sort of becomes this psychological abyss that you can fall into if you don't just let nature take its course in some degree. Robert Louis Stevenson, who wrote The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, he was a very ill man for most of his life. He suffered from the fallouts of tuberculosis, and so during the time that he was writing, cocaine was actually used as a drug to treat his side effects of that. And whenever he came under this fever, this sickness, and was treating, he referred to himself often as myself and the other fellow, where myself was his sort of everyday persona, and the other fellow was his high, under the influence entity, kind of, this dual identity that is so prevalent not only in this story, but in all of his stories, or many of them. In society, you had not a full understanding of drug addiction at the time, but the formal customs in society were starting to dissolve, and people were struggling from addictions without necessarily intending to or knowing it. Not that anybody really intends to do it, but they were living in this age of reason with more free and radical thinking, and you started to see the framework for early psychology, which stated that a person could be viewed in two lights. And a lot of this comes into being within his stories because Dr. Jekyll, to turn into Mr. Hyde, he takes a powder. It's a white crystalline substance, not unlike cocaine. And Dr. Jekyll comes from this wealthy family where he has these societal pressures on him to conform, to, to work, to live as expected. But he craves more. He craves knowledge and realization of his own. And that drives him to become a doctor and eventually goes on to create this Jekyll persona, which acts very much like an addiction. And then lastly, I know I'm really short on time, but Bram Stoker, whenever he was writing Dracula, at the time, it may not have exactly seemed like a story that had a lot to say about sex or venereal disease, but ever since could be viewed in that light. At the time, you were getting control over diseases and all of that, but religion still sort of had the stronghold on the way that people viewed sex and gender roles. And Stoker himself, he suffered from syphilis, which, of course, due to the taboo nature, he did not address often. And so in his stories, whenever we have the exchange of blood and the vampire fangs, we have them more as euphemisms and phallic symbols, even. And from there, we have within the story, only men biting women. The women can never bite the men, almost like women couldn't have control over their own sex lives. And men could not bite other men because then that would suggest homosexuality, which also at the time was too taboo to discuss. So religion is really used to ward off Dracula and the vampires within the story, and eventually, spoiler alert, weakens him and enables them to sort of defeat this monster. So Bram Stoker was almost falling to these societal religious expectations whenever he wrote. But whenever you are reading it, again, there's just a lot more than originally meets the eye. It's more than just a scary tale. So even in today's society, the way that we communicate in classrooms with topics, if people aren't as willing to discuss, immigration or the Me Too movement, whatever it is, there's likely a scary story out there that will help you facilitate that conversation where maybe they won't be taking it head on, but they will be still thinking about these themes and these struggles just in a bit of a different light. Thank you.